welcome into the party, our party. After years in the toxic SNP, it is just so refreshing for me to have a place in a party where we support each other and where we work together as a team. For me, it has been beyond fantastic, actually, to meet with so many people this weekend. And I look forward to working with you all in the months and years ahead. Conference, leaving the SNP has not been easy. And I don't mean that because I miss my former party at all. Far from it. But nationalists and their supporters have tried to make my life a living hell and that of my family ever since I left. I have had death threats. I had one person say they wanted to brick me in the street, and others say they wanted to burn me and my family alive. I now have had to have panic alarms fitted into my home, and Parliament have helped to strengthen and reinforce the doors and windows in my house. In the week that I left the SNP, I even had to take my family to a safe house. That's where politics in Scotland has descended to. As a mother, I told my daughters, I said, we're going on a break. I said that to protect them. Conference, I knew that leaving SNP would mean I would become a target for the very, very worst of nationalism. But the vile threats that I have received were beyond even my wildest imagination. Rather than engaging in the substance of issues, nationalist trolls resorted to bullying, and I'm sure that very many of you here today have experienced this too. Far, far too often, figures within the party have turned a blind eye to this, or at worst have seen complicit in it. Those who do not conform to nationalist orthodoxy in Scotland or have tried to challenge positions of those in power are dismissed, they're degraded and they're shouted down in public. Whilst in private, shadowy figures and anonymous accounts have used social media to harass and menace people, to bully them. So let me say to my former party, political arguments should never be made through intimidation and threats of violence. Thank you. It's so heartfelt. We all have a real responsibility, I feel, to stand up in Scotland, across the UK, particularly those nationalists who seek to undermine our democracy through bullying. No matter our political colours, we must stand united and we must challenge this. Conference, since leaving the SNP, I have been absolutely overwhelmed. I cannot thank you enough for the support that I have received in the Conservative Party. Previously, when I tried to speak about difficulties I had faced with former colleagues, I was ignored or silenced. Yet in the Conservatives, people have been treating me with respect, dignity and seriousness. Thank you so, so much to everybody here today. Conservatives across Scotland and the United Kingdom have been my stalwart in times of turmoil for myself and my family. And I want to give a particular thank you to our Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, who has been a constant source of warmth and kindness to me. I also want to thank Alistair Jack, Secretary of State for Scotland, who reached out and supported my family when we had to go into hiding. And to our wonderful Scottish Conservative leader, Douglas Ross, who has made my transition as easy as possible and who works day and night to promote Scotland and the Union across both of our parliaments. I don't know where he has the energy and finds it from. So believe me, I've had the experience when I say that this party is a special place that you all can be very, very proud of. Conference, this year we face a general election, and right across Scotland, more and more people like me are seeing the true face of nationalism. They can see that in so many ways it is ugly and divisive, that it thrives on splitting Scotland, in turning our country inwards and against itself, in two camps, into us and them. When we know that Scotland is so much more, it is diverse and welcoming and such a proud, proud country. So the SNP deserve to lose, and they deserve to lose big. They have let down Scotland on every front, and they are failing to deliver in government. So for those Scots who are fed up with division, fed up with mismanaged public services and a stagnant Scottish economy without aspiration, the Scottish Conservatives are your natural home. And my message is that in key seats across our country, voters must know that it's only the Scottish Conservatives who can beat the SNP, and that will strive to take Scotland forward. Thank you again for being so kind and welcoming to myself and my family, and I mean that from the very bottom of my heart. And now, Conference, I'd like you to join me in giving a very, very warm welcome to my colleague and friend and our wonderful party leader, to Douglas Ross.
Lisa, thank you. That was a powerful, brave and inspiring speech, and I am so glad to welcome you to your first Scottish Conservative Conference. And Lisa's journey to our party is a great example of how we, the Scottish Conservatives, are winning people over from the SNP right across the country. By standing up for their values, ending the divisive debate around independence and taking Scotland forward. Lisa, it's shocking to hear about the abuse you and your family have faced, but I'm so glad that you feel welcome and supported here in your natural home, the Scottish Conservatives. Conference, I also want to start my speech with us all giving a massive round of applause to our newest Scottish Conservative councillor, John Bathgate. John, well done. We didn't just beat the SNP in Jedburgh, but by winning. By a whopping 58% of the vote, we knocked them out of the park. John, well done. It's a great achievement for John as our newest elected member, and of course John Lamont, Rachel Hamilton, Ewan Jardine and the rest of the team that secured such a great result. And it's not just in the borders. In January, Thomas Heald won in Dunblane, and before that, Alan Lamont beat the SNP in Girvan. Right across Scotland, the Scottish Conservatives are taking the fight to the SNP, and we are winning. When we come together as one Scottish Conservative team, when we get out on the doorstep, we can win, and these results prove that. We need to take the same campaigning spirit into this year's general election. Now, the Scottish Conservatives have defied the odds before, and we will do so again this year. And we're facing an SNP that's on its knees, that is the weakest it's been in a decade. And we have some outstanding candidates, like Kathleen Robertson, who I hope and expect to be my local MP in Moray West, Nairn and Strathspey. Stephen Kerr, who, having worked with him on the green benches at Westminster and in Holyrood just now, I know will be the most passionate and committed campaigner for Angus and Perthshire Glens. Harriet Cross, who I've campaigned with all over the Gordon and Buchan seat and is eager to start to work for the people and the communities that have been failed by the SNP. And Martin Dowie in Ayr, Carrick and Cumnock, leading the council in South Ayrshire and leading the fight for the Scottish Conservatives to beat the SNP in that seat. Just some of our incredible candidates for this year's election. So, as Megan and Craig, our great Deputy Leader and Party Chair, said yesterday, confidence, let's put in the hard work, let's take our message from this hall to the Scottish people, let's get out there and win. Conference, it's great to be back here in Aberdeen, in the beating heart of our nation's economy. Now, I believe that Aberdeen is Scotland's most important city. And no, that's not just because I was born here, 11 crucial minutes before my twin sister, but because for decades, this city and the region that surrounds it has been and continues to be Europe's oil and gas capital. The centre of an industry that supports over 100,000 Scottish jobs and contributed almost a tenth of the funding for our public services last year. Yet almost as amazing is the opportunity to lead the world in the development of renewable energy, making an essential contribution to not just Scotland, but the whole of the United Kingdom's transition to net zero. Workers and businesses in this city and across the northeast of Scotland stand on the brink of a renewables revolution that could build the backbone of the Scottish economy for the future, creating highly skilled, well-paid jobs, driving forward growth while cutting bills for families. And it's a revolution that will be funded and driven by the expertise we see in the oil and gas sector today. Yet all of this is being put at risk by an anti-Aberdeen, anti-North East alliance. A partnership between Labour and the SNP determined to close down Scotland's oil and gas sector and put a bright future that it currently holds at risk. Keir Starmer, Anas Sawar and Humza Yousaf are lining up together to tell companies not to invest here, not to create jobs, not to stay in Aberdeen. Now, Humza Yousaf now claims he supports oil and gas, but oil and gas workers won't be fooled by his apparent change of heart. Labour's energy plans would risk jobs, hurt businesses and ruin Scotland's economy. Humza Yousaf is disappointed not because of the damage those plans would undoubtedly do, but because he didn't think of them himself. Because Labour's plan sounds a lot like it was written by the SNP. Humza Yousaf and his party are false friends of the oil and gas industry. Humza Yousaf opposes new investment in the sector, just like Labour. Humza Yousaf is against new licences in the North Sea. He's against the Cambo development. He's against the Rosebank energy field. The gap between Humza Yousaf's words and his actions used to be wider than the Clyde, now they're wider than the North Sea. Just look at who he's got in government with him. Humza Yousaf has said his party's coalition deal with the extreme anti-oil Greens is worth its weight in gold. Conference. No champion of the North East would ever use that phrase to describe Patrick Harvey and Lorna Slater. The Greens. The Greens want to shut down Scotland's oil and gas industry. Not in 30 years, or 10 years, or even 1 year. They don't even want to wait until next week. They think it should have been shut down yesterday. They wished it was closed years ago. That's who Humza Yousaf has sitting round his cabinet table taking decisions for the future of Scotland. The reality is that Labour and the SNP are in unison in talking down Aberdeen and the North East. Neither party wants this city to succeed, to continue to be the heart of Scotland's economy. Both would rather that jobs and emissions are outsourced to other countries like Putin's Russia. It's beyond clear that there is only one party standing up for the jobs of oil and gas workers, standing up for Scotland's economy, standing up to protect our transition to net zero, delivered here in Aberdeen, standing up for the North East, and that party is the Scottish Conservatives. We will always fight for a fair deal for the North East. With our incredible Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire councillors, MPs and MSPs, we'll always back Scotland's energy sector and Scottish jobs. We will always be on your side, focused on your priorities. That's my promise to voters in this part of the country for the election that will come later on this year. Come on. Let's remove the SNP and get the North East to net zero this year. Conference. When I last spoke to you in Glasgow, Humza Yousaf had been SNP leader for a mere 5 weeks. Now he's almost a year into the job. Yes, it has only been that long. But what a year it has been. His predecessor, Nicola Sturgeon, the woman he idolised, who he described as the most impressive politician in Europe and said he was the continuity candidate for, well, she's been arrested, along with her husband, the former chief executive, and the party treasurer. And the SNP today remain under police investigation. Humza Yousaf, alongside his mentors, Nicola Sturgeon and John Swinney, has seemingly misled 2 public inquiries over the retention of pandemic messages. His government lost their court challenge over Sturgeon's gender self-ID bill, and under Scottish Conservative pressure had to drop many of its nonsensical plans, from the deposit return scheme to highly protected marine areas. The number of U-turns would make you dizzy. And the SNP have descended into infighting. One MSP even said this week that his party under Humza Yousaf had become authoritarian. He's a bit late. You know, many of us have accused the SNP of that time and time again. We claim that they're running a nanny state, but maybe that was a bit unfair. Even nanny would allow you to have your porridge. And of course, who could forget the disgraceful resignation, finally, of the former Health Secretary, Michael Matheson. A man Humza Yousaf hand-picked to run the health service in Scotland. Well, he somehow racked up an £11,000 roaming bill while on holiday in Morocco, and then charged it to the taxpayer, saying it was for parliamentary work. Now, if that was true, Morocco Mick would have been typing and sending emails every 10 seconds for an entire day. Nobody believed it, except, of course, the gullible Humza Yousaf. And then the story changed, and Matheson admitted his kids had been watching the Old Firm game, which he, as a massive football fan, claimed he was completely unaware of. So we've got to picture this scene. The children are encouraging to watch the match, and they say, Dad, come and see what's happening in the Old Firm match. And the reply goes, sorry kids, I can't at the moment, I'm answering my 8,640th email of the day. Again, no one believed this except for Humza Yousaf. And instead of sacking his health minister for blatantly lying, he stood by his mate until the bitter end, believing every single new version of the story. It was lie after lie after lie. And in the process, Humza Yousaf burned any credibility he had. Humza Yousaf is not just failing and gaffe-prone, he lacks any principle and backbone. He would rather play the sycophant to Nicola Sturgeon than address the damage that her shameful legacy has done to our country. He would rather cover up the tracks of his predecessors and keep the bodies buried than deliver openness and transparency. He would rather be the fall guy for 17 years of SNP incompetence and secrecy than step up and be his own man. Humza Yousaf is totally unfit to be Scotland's First Minister. In WhatsApp messages revealed by the UK COVID inquiry, Humza Yousaf said, I am winging it and will get found out sooner rather than later. Conference, we all knew that a long time ago. Humza has been found out in every job he's done. He was the Transport Secretary when the trains never ran on time and celebrated the launch of a ferry with painted-on windows. He was the Justice Secretary who left police at breaking point and brought in the disastrous Hate Crime Act. He was the Health Secretary who let waiting times spiral out of control and Audit Scotland said had no vision for the NHS. Only in the SNP would he fail upwards. And he has been found out, not just by the public, but increasingly by his own party. Now, let's be honest, we've all called him useless. We have. Plenty of other people have called him useless. But I didn't realise he thought it himself. Conference, we need better than a First Minister who is winging it with the lives and livelihoods of Scots. This general election this year is our opportunity to send Humza Yousaf packing. But it's not just Humza Yousaf who's been found out. It's the whole rotten SNP government. Now, we all remember the bold SNP claim that world leaders were lining up to ask them for advice. Really, we've got to wonder what they were calling up about. Were they asking the SNP how to build ferries? Or maybe how to deliver key roads on time? Or wait, did they think the Nats could tell them how to win a referendum? No, they failed on all these things. And the idea that Joe Biden or Emmanuel Macron have Humza Yousaf on speed dial for advice is absolutely laughable. Because the truth is, of course, the SNP have an appalling record in governing Scotland. On health, 1 in 7 Scots, over 800,000 people, are on an NHS waiting list. On education, Scotland has reached record lows in every subject in international league tables. And on our economy, Scotland's growth has lagged behind the rest of the UK, costing our economy more than £8 billion. Nobody can deny that this is a record of failure. Compared with 2007, in Scotland today, your job prospects are narrower. The education your children will receive is poorer. And when you or your loved ones need it most, the NHS will take longer to help you. We aren't just living poorer lives, the lives that we live are shorter as well. Drug and alcohol deaths are higher. Scotland has some of the worst 5-year survival rates for the most deadly cancers in the developed world. Worse still, life expectancy in Scotland is the lowest of any part of our country and has fallen for the last 3 years. Under the SNP, Scotland has become the sick man of the United Kingdom. On every front, our quality of life is getting worse, and this nationalist government are to blame. They say they're stronger for Scotland, but Scotland has not become any stronger during their time in power. Our horizons have shrunk. We've become bitter and inward-facing, more interested in fighting each other, in arguing about the names of cafes than tackling the big issues facing our country. In nationalist world, who cares about roads and hospitals when you can play at being Jacobites and redcoats? We are living in the past instead of facing the future. Is that really what we want our country to be? And what kind of future will that be anyway? Education. Education was supposed to be the SNP's #1 priority. But the next generation of Scots are leaving school with fewer skills than their parents. And more international students are winning places at our universities instead of homegrown talent because the SNP's cap on places. The late Winnie Ewing's famous nationalist slogan from 1967 was "Stop the World. Scotland wants to get on." Yet under this SNP government, Scotland has stopped while the rest of the world has carried on. And that is something we must all regret. This year marks the 10th anniversary since independence referendum. 10 years since Let We Never Forget conference, the campaign to stay part of the United Kingdom prevailed. Yet instead of accepting the result and healing those divisions, the SNP inflamed them. They continued to push for a rerun of the contest again and again and again. They ignored the result. They didn't even try to bring our country back together. And now, despite going through COVID, a global cost of living crisis, and 3 First Ministers, nothing has changed. The SNP have continued to campaign for independence, and as a consequence, we remain a divided nation. A nation stuck, not going anywhere. So long as the SNP government stays in office, they will continue to split Scotland, to further their own political obsession and hold on to power. We've seen it happen for the last 17 years, and the future will be no different. Humza Yousaf has been very clear. Independence will be page 1, line 1 of his party's manifesto. Not our roads, or our economy, or our schools, or our hospitals. Independence. That's his top priority. That's the only priority of his party. They are never going to change. The only way that our nation gets its future back is for Scotland to rise up and be that united nation again, and that can only happen if we take Scotland forward. We can only do that if the SNP are removed from our politics, removed at all levels, in every election. We beat their candidates, we kick out their councillors, their MSPs, their MPs, and we reject their independence campaign every single time. And conference, we know in this hall that in so many parts of Scotland, the only party that can take Scotland forward is the Scottish Conservatives. And that work starts with this year's general election. Because we have a golden opportunity. An opportunity to deliver a fatal blow to the SNP government and to their independence cause. Like all of you, I've been knocking on doors in every part of Scotland for years. But I've noticed a change in the conversations that I've been having, and I know you have too. More and more people are looking beyond previous party loyalties. More than anything else, they want the local nationalist MP booted out and for Humza Yousaf's government to be put on notice. They know that Scotland can't move on, that their priorities will continue to be ignored until that happens. Humza Yousaf has said he wants the next election to be all about independence, that every single SNP MP elected will contribute to his government's mandate for separation. Well, let's seize this opportunity to bury his obsession for good. Let's come together and beat his candidates. Humza Yousaf has said he wants a Tory-free Scotland. In fact, he's staked what little reputation he has left on it. Well, I have an unfortunate dose of reality for him. That ain't gonna happen. If Nicola Sturgeon couldn't manage it at the peak of her powers, then the continuity understudy is going to flop, and he's going to flop hard. We saw her off, and we will see Humza Yousaf off too. In 2014, we campaigned as part of Better Together to beat the nationalists and keep our country united. We won, and let us never forget that. Let us never forget that when we come together, when the pro-UK majority unites, we can beat the SNP. 10 years ago, we showed that could happen. But then we made a mistake. We got complacent when the SNP were down, but not out. A decade on from that referendum, we must not make the same mistake again. Yes, the SNP look weak now, but they will pick themselves back up. If pro-UK voters want to kick the nationalists out, then they need to once again unite behind the Scottish Conservatives. Even the SNP say that in most seats across Scotland, they are contests between the nationalists and us. So if the pro-UK majority gets behind us, then we can beat the SNP and take Scotland forward. Let's seize this opportunity to make sure that Humza Yousaf is found out for the last time. Because conference, the winging it First Minister is already on his last legs. His days in office are numbered. Doubts are growing. Not just across the country, as we hear on a daily basis, but within his own party as well. Even the SNP are starting to realise that Humza Yousaf is a dud. Now, we already got rid of Nicola Sturgeon. Let's use this general election to shove Humza Yousaf out of the door. We will do that. We will do that if the pro-UK majority unites and votes together in the key seats where it's a straight fight between the Scottish Conservatives and the SNP. We can beat them up and down the country. We can make sure it's not only a bad night for the SNP, but a terrible night for Humza Yousaf. If we come together in those crucial SNP Scottish Conservative contests, it won't be a camper van that Humza Yousaf needs. It will be a removal van. And let's just make sure that, unlike last time, he has got insurance, or we'll have another SNP leader under police investigation. Conference, let's convince the pro-UK anti-SNP majority to get behind the Scottish Conservatives. Let's rip up Humza Yousaf's independence plan and together take Scotland forward to a better future. However, beating the SNP and moving the country on from Humza Yousaf's independence obsession is only half of the task. If we want to take Scotland forward, then we need to have the policies and the plans to tackle the big challenges our nation faces, to undo the damage that 17 years of SNP government has created. It's the responsibility of an aspirational party to do the work and come up with those plans. I became leader of our party 4 years ago to stand up for the communities that have been left behind by the SNP, to make the case for a forgotten Scotland that Holyrood too often ignores. Whether it's rural and island communities seeking lifeline services at risk of closure, people and businesses failed by broken promises on transport, workers and their families considering their future in a high-tax Scotland, victims let down by a justice system on the side of criminals, or some of our most vulnerable people unable to access the vital help they need. As leader of the Scottish Conservatives, I will always be on your side, campaigning on the issues that matter to you. That's why I'm in this job, to be the champion for the people who too often feel voiceless in the Scottish Parliament, to challenge the Holyrood consensus on their behalf and tackle the real issues that they face. That's why over the past year I've launched our party's plans to grow the economy and restore our NHS, ensuring that on the two biggest priorities for voters across Scotland, we have a clear prospectus. And it's also why at this conference we've showcased our 5 key promises for the general election. While the SNP has independence on page 1 of its manifesto, it will be our 5 key priorities on page 1 of the Scottish Conservative manifesto. And they start with repairing and upgrading roads right across Scotland. Living in Murray, where I am very proud to stay, and I mention it quite a few times, but living in Murray, I travel to the Scottish Parliament every week and I use Scotland's most dangerous road, the A9. Since 2009, over 100 people have lost their lives simply travelling along this route. Yet the SNP announced last year, on the 20th of December, that they were a decade behind schedule in upgrading this vital road. I cannot imagine a worse Christmas present for Perthshire and the north of Scotland, or a better representation of how those communities, those in forgotten Scotland, are treated as second-class citizens by successive Glasgow-based SNP leaders. We in the North East know that if the A9 or the A96 were called the M8, they would have been upgraded years ago. Yet it isn't just the roads from Perth to Inverness and Inverness to Aberdeen. Every part of Scotland has its own road that this SNP government promised to upgrade and year after year fails to deliver on. Or a local route riddled with potholes that is the consequence of years of underfunding for local government. That's why the Scottish Conservatives would make upgrading the road network our top infrastructure priority. With Douglas Lumsden and Graham Simpson leading our transport team, we will deliver on the SNP's broken promises to upgrade the A9, the A96, the A83, the A75, the A77 and so many other crucial routes. And we will give local councils the fair funding they need to plug the potholes. While the SNP Green Government tax workers just for parking their cars, the Scottish Conservatives will stand up for drivers. Yet it's not just on the roads that the SNP have delayed investment. We know that all NHS building upgrades have now been delayed for at least 2 years. Well, since 2012, 86 local health facilities have been closed, many in rural communities. So on one hand, we have rampant centralisation, but on the other, we have no new investments being made and facilities that are left to ruin. The SNP are running our NHS into the ground, and a succession of health ministers have been more interested in saving their jobs than saving patients. Contrast that with our health spokesperson, Dr Sandish Kulhani, a man who entered into politics to stand up for healthcare workers and patients. As Scottish Conservatives, we know that closing local facilities is a false economy that only puts further pressure on the rest of the NHS. As the MP for Murray, I've been working with the Save Our Surgeries group, campaigning to reinstate the GP services in Burghead and Hopeman. These facilities are crucial to both the villages, and thousands have signed the petition to get the surgeries reopened. So far that's fallen on deaf ears with the Scottish Government and the Health Board. But next month they'll be in Holyrood after I secured a members' debate about their future. We all know how vital these local practices are to our own communities, and that's why we would ban further closures in healthcare facilities. And we would also recruit 1,000 additional GPs to ensure that no one, anywhere in Scotland, has to wait longer than a week for an appointment. Now, another essential service that is in dire need of fresh leadership is our education system. Scotland's schools used to be the envy of the world, yet now, under the SNP, perform worse than Latvia or Slovenia in maths and science. Nicola Sturgeon said in 2016 that closing the attainment gap was her #1 priority, but since then it has barely moved. As a father, I want my 2 boys to have at least the same standard of education that I enjoyed when they go to our local schools. Yet this SNP government is ripping up everything that makes Scotland's schools great. Jenny Gilruth couldn't even be bothered to read a teacher survey about school violence in Aberdeen. What hope do we have if the Education Secretary won't even do her own homework? She must. But seriously, it is the Scottish Conservatives who are the only party that are bringing forward plans for our education system and standing up for Scottish education traditions. Our education spokesperson, Liam Kerr, is drawing up plans to reduce class sizes, reinforce discipline in our schools and restore our traditional exam system. Yet it's not just in schools that people feel less safe in the SNP's Scotland. Crime has risen to its highest level since 2018, and violent crime has increased to its highest level for more than a decade. Yet in response, the SNP have cut 1,000 police officers and closed 140 local police stations in a decade. And at the same time, they've reduced sentences and introduced a presumption against short prison sentences. In the SNP's Scotland, a man under the age of 25 will not automatically go to prison if they commit rape. What kind of country do we live in if rapists can avoid jail? The SNP's soft-touch justice system is a gift to the worst of Scotland's criminals and a disgrace to the victims. That's why we've got plans to introduce a victims' law, to put the justice system on the side of the victims, not the perpetrator. And why our justice spokesperson And it's why our Justice spokesperson, Russell Finlay, has announced at this conference our plans to reform the Scottish Sentencing Council to include more representation from victims. Conference, unlike the Holyrood Consensus parties, the Scottish Conservatives will always stand for harder sentences on dangerous criminals. We will always believe that crime must be punished. Yet, and I declare, as a very proud husband of a serving police officer, it's also essential that we give the police the resources as well as the powers to keep Scotland's streets safe. That's why we would put 1,000 extra police officers onto our streets so they can do the job and properly tackle the crimes that blight our communities. But let's be clear. None of this can happen unless we grow Scotland's economy and allow more sustainable investment in our public services. One of the biggest barriers we face to achieving this is higher taxes. Scotland is the highest tax part of the United Kingdom, and it's a position supported by every other party in the Scottish Parliament, the SNP and the Greens, but also Labour and the Liberal Democrats. It's only the Scottish Conservatives and our economy and finance teams, led by Liz Smith and Murdo Fraser, who are standing up against the Holyrood Consensus of higher taxes, who believe that it's unfair for workers in Scotland to pay more than their counterparts in the rest of the United Kingdom, but get less. We are Scotland's only pro-business, pro-worker, pro-growth party, and we go into the next general election with a promise to cut taxes for Scottish taxpayers. We know this is the best way to stimulate Scottish growth, to give families more money in their pockets and over the long term fund our public services. Conference, these are the 5 pledges we're promising to voters at the upcoming general election. We will fight a campaign focusing on turning the page on constitutionalism, with a clear plan to beat the SNP in seats up and down the country, so we can deliver on the real priorities the Scottish people have, and we, Scottish Conservatives, can take Scotland forward. Conference, this year's general election could not be more important. This election is about our future as a nation, a battle for the soul of Scotland. For the last 17 years, the SNP have dominated Scottish politics, and look what has happened to our country. We've become poorer, smaller, a more divided country than when the Nationalists took office. I mentioned earlier that the SNP have failed oil and gas workers, but that's not the only group they've let down. They've failed our children, they've failed our patients, they've failed our workers, they've failed our victims, they've failed our communities. They deserve to pay the price for failing Scotland for the last 17 years. And this year, with the SNP divided and a hamstrung Humza Yousaf, we have been given a golden opportunity to do that. He has said he wants the wipeout of the Scottish Conservatives at this election. Well, instead, let's kick out his candidates up and down the country. Let's give Useless his P45 and put his nationalist government on notice. If we do that, we can take Scotland forward and focus on the issues that really matter, like repairing our roads, ending long NHS waits, restoring our schools, making Scotland safer and cutting tax. All of these are the real priorities of the Scottish people, not separation. But that can only happen if pro-UK, anti-SNP voters unite behind the Scottish Conservatives in seats across the country. If Humza Yousaf wins in those seats, then that will only strengthen his position and embolden his party to campaign even more on independence. And a vote for any other party is just a waste. Use us as your vehicle to make the SNP pay for years of distraction and neglect. Let's beat them together, just like we did 10 years ago. Let's show Humza Yousaf the door. Let's bring down the curtain on the SNP Scotland, on a decade of division, and let's take Scotland forward to a better future together. Thank you very much.